Welcome to today's story, an intense and emotional journey that peels back the layers of trust, love, and betrayal. In the quiet, picturesque setting of a suburban town, Emily seemed to have it all: a loving family, a stable marriage, and a respected place in her community. But one fateful choice, an affair with a charismatic gym owner, shatters the illusion of her perfect life. What follows is a whirlwind of heartbreak, scandal, and judgment as her husband Daniel fights to cope with the betrayal, and their two children are caught in the devastating emotional wreckage. As whispers of her indiscretions spread through their tight-knit town, Emily faces mounting consequences at every turn, from unraveling relationships to the shocking revelation of her lover's true colors. This is a story of infidelity's far-reaching impact, the painful search for redemption, and the resilience needed to rebuild when everything falls apart. Stick with us for this gripping tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. It was the summer of 2016 in the quiet suburban town of Maplewood, where the streets were lined with neat rows of maple trees. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and the sound of cicadas filled the warm evenings. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your name and at least half of your secrets, though they pretended not to. On the surface, Maplewood seemed like the perfect place to raise a family, but as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. Meet our protagonist, Emily Carter. At 34, she was the kind of woman you'd pass on the street and think, she looks like she has it all figured out. And for the most part, Emily did have her life in order, or at least that's what everyone thought. She was married to Daniel Carter, a handsome, dependable accountant with a knack for dad jokes and the kind of steadiness that had once made her feel safe. Together, they had two children: Sophie, a precocious 9-year-old with a head full of wild curls, and Max, a quiet 6-year-old who had inherited his father's penchant for building things. Emily and Daniel's house was the picture of suburban bliss: white picket fence, a swing set in the backyard, and flower boxes Emily had meticulously tended every spring. But like many marriages in their 10th year, cracks had begun to form beneath the glossy exterior. Emily's days were a whirlwind of school drop-offs, meal planning, and freelance graphic design gigs squeezed into the cracks of her schedule. She loved her kids fiercely, but somewhere along the way, she had started to feel invisible, not just to Daniel, but to herself. The spark that had once ignited their relationship had fizzled out, replaced by a steady routine that felt more like cohabitation than a partnership. Daniel, ever pragmatic, didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't let on. He worked long hours, always coming home exhausted, his mind still preoccupied with numbers and spreadsheets. Their conversations had dwindled to logistical updates. What time is Sophie's soccer game? Did you pay the electric bill? What's for dinner? And then there was Michael Bennett. Michael was a new face in Maplewood, having moved to town earlier that year to open a boutique gym in the downtown area. He was in his late 30s, tall, with a runner's build and a smile that seemed to light up the room. He'd quickly become a local favorite, charming the town's residents with his easygoing nature and infectious enthusiasm. Emily had first met him at a neighborhood block party. She remembered the way his eyes lingered on hers a beat too long, the subtle magnetism that made her cheeks flush despite herself. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before Michael became a name she couldn't get out of her head, he was just another acquaintance in a town full of friendly faces. The story begins on an unremarkable Thursday morning in June. Emily stood in the kitchen, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a coffee mug in one hand, and Sophie's lunchbox in the other. The morning chaos was in full swing. Sophie was arguing with Max over which cartoon to watch, and Daniel was scrolling through emails at the counter, barely glancing up as Emily moved around the kitchen. "Did you remember Sophie's soccer jersey?" Daniel asked absently, his eyes glued to his phone. Emily sighed, setting the lunchbox down with a little more force than necessary. "It's in her backpack. I've got it under control." He nodded, still not looking up. It wasn't that Daniel was a bad husband. He was kind, reliable, and good with the kids. But lately, it felt like he was more of a roommate than a partner. By the time Emily dropped the kids off at school, her mood had soured. She drove to the coffee shop downtown to work on a client's website redesign, trying to shake the growing restlessness that had been gnawing at her for months. That's when she saw Michael. He was sitting at a corner table, sipping an iced coffee and flipping through a fitness magazine. He looked up as she walked in, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Emily, hey!" he called out, waving her over. For a moment, she hesitated. She could have easily waved back and found her own table, kept things casual. But there was something about the way he said her name, like it mattered, like she mattered against her better judgment. She walked over. "Michael," she said, setting her laptop bag on the chair across from him. "What brings you here?" "Morning coffee ritual," he replied with a grin. "And you working or escaping?" "Both," she admitted, laughing softly. "Freelance life." They talked for a while, just small talk at first. How his gym was doing, how her kids were enjoying summer break. But there was an ease to their conversation that surprised her. He asked about her work, her interests, even her favorite books. Questions that felt deeper than the surface-level exchanges she'd grown accustomed to. She found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. When she finally opened her laptop to work, her thoughts kept drifting back to Michael. She told herself it was harmless, just a pleasant interaction with a friendly neighbor. But deep down, a part of her knew it was more than that. As the weeks went on, Emily and Michael began crossing paths more often, a chance encounter at the grocery store, a wave from across the park during one of Sophie's soccer practices. Each interaction was brief, but the energy between them crackled with an unspoken tension. Emily told herself she was imagining it. She was just lonely, that's all. It didn't mean anything. But late at night, when Daniel was asleep beside her, she found herself replaying their conversations, wondering what it was about Michael that made her feel so alive. And then came the gym membership. "Mom, everyone's parents are doing it," Sophie had exclaimed one afternoon, waving a flyer for Michael's gym in Emily's face. "They even have yoga classes. You love yoga." Emily had laughed it off at first, but the idea took root. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done something for herself, something that wasn't tied to her roles as a wife or mother. Joining the gym seemed like a harmless way to reclaim a bit of her identity. But of course, it wasn't harmless. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. From the moment Emily walked into Michael's gym, she felt a rush of nerves she couldn't quite explain. The space was sleek and modern, filled with the rhythmic thud of weights and the hum of treadmills. Michael greeted her at the front desk, his smile as warm as ever. "Finally decided to join us, huh?" he teased, handing her a welcome packet. "I guess I couldn't resist the peer pressure," she joked, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when their hands brushed. Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into her workouts. At first, it was just about getting in shape, carving out a sliver of time in her day that was entirely her own. But inevitably, her sessions started to overlap with Michael's schedule. He'd spot her on the weight bench, offer pointers during a group class, or stop to chat after her cool-down stretches. Each interaction left her feeling simultaneously exhilarated and guilty. She told herself it was nothing more than harmless flirtation, but the way Michael's gaze lingered on her made it clear he didn't see it that way. And then, one day after class, he asked her to grab coffee. Emily hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to say no. But instead, she heard herself say, "Sure, why not?" They sat outside the coffee shop, the summer sun casting dappled shadows on the table between them. At first, the conversation was light, talking about workout routines and favorite music playlists. But as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. "You seem different lately," Michael said, his eyes searching hers. "Like there's a part of you that's waking up." Emily's breath caught. It was such a simple statement, but it cut straight to the core of what she hadn't even admitted to herself. She looked away, the weight of his words settling over her. "I don't know what you mean," she said softly, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Michael leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "I think you do." The afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows of the coffee shop, but Emily barely noticed Michael's words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I think you do." She stirred her coffee absently, unsure how to respond. What could she say that he was right, that she felt something, a spark, a connection, that terrified and thrilled her at the same time? She settled for a small, nervous laugh. "You're imagining things." Michael leaned back, his expression unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes didn't waver. "Maybe," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. They finished their coffee with an awkward air of restraint, and when they parted ways, Emily told herself it was for the best. But as she drove home, her mind was a whirl of emotions she couldn't quite name. And deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of whatever was happening between them. Over the next few weeks, Emily tried to avoid Michael. She shifted her gym schedule to early mornings before he usually arrived, and kept her interactions polite but brief. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't escape him entirely. One Saturday, during Sophie's soccer game, Emily was sitting in the bleachers, half watching the kids scramble across the field, when a familiar voice caught her attention. "Cheering for number 12? She turned to see Michael standing a few rows behind her, wearing that same easy smile. He gestured toward Sophie, who was chasing the ball with a determined look. "She's got some serious hustle." Emily's pulse quickened. "Yeah, she's pretty competitive," she said, forcing a laugh. Michael slid into the seat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "How have you been?" he asked, his tone casual, though the question carried a weight that made Emily's chest tighten. "Busy," she replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the field. "You?" "Same," he said, though his gaze lingered on her longer than it should have. "I've missed seeing you around the gym." Emily didn't respond, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say but couldn't. The tension between them was palpable, a silent current neither of them seemed able to resist. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Emily had just finished a yoga class at the gym and was gathering her things in the locker room when Michael appeared in the doorway. He looked hesitant, like he knew he shouldn't be there, but couldn't help himself. "Hey," he said softly, his voice carrying over the hum of the rain outside. "Got a minute?" Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should say no, that she should walk past him without looking back, but instead, she nodded. "Yeah." They ended up in his office, a small, sparsely decorated space at the back of the gym. Michael closed the door behind them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with anticipation. "I don't want to make things harder for you," Michael said finally, his voice low and earnest, "but I can't stop thinking about you." Emily's breath caught. "Michael, I know," he said quickly, cutting her off. "I know it's complicated, but I've never felt this way before, and I think you feel it too." She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over her face. She looked away, her hands trembling as she clutched her gym bag. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Life's not fair," Michael replied, his tone laced with frustration. "But that doesn't mean we should ignore this." Before she could respond, he stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. The electricity between them was undeniable, and in that moment, Emily made a choice she would come to regret. She closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a kiss that was equal parts passion and desperation. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the weight of her responsibilities and doubts melted away, but as they pulled apart, reality crashed back in, heavy and unforgiving. "I can't do this," Emily said, her voice shaking. She grabbed her bag and bolted from the room, leaving Michael standing there, his expression a mix of longing and regret. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Daniel snored softly beside her. Her mind replayed the kiss over and over, each memory laced with guilt. She had crossed a line, and there was no taking it back. The days that followed were a blur of strained smiles and restless nights. She avoided Michael entirely, skipping the gym and dodging his texts, which alternated between apologies and pleas to talk. But no matter how hard she tried to push him out of her mind, he was always there, a constant presence in her thoughts. At home, the distance between Emily and Daniel grew even wider. She found herself snapping at him over small things, frustrated by his obliviousness to the storm raging inside her. And though he tried to brush it off, it was clear he knew something was wrong. "You've been different lately," Daniel said one evening as they sat on the couch, the TV playing in the background. "Is everything okay?" Emily forced a smile, her stomach twisting with guilt. "I'm just tired," she said, hoping he wouldn't press further. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke her. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess, to beg for his forgiveness. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with fear and shame. "I'm fine," she said instead, pulling her hand away. "Really." It was a month before Emily saw Michael again. She had convinced herself that the kiss was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that wouldn't happen again. But when she walked into the coffee shop one afternoon and saw him sitting at a table by the window, her resolve crumbled. Michael looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he said softly, his voice tinged with relief. "Michael," she replied, her heart pounding. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their last encounter hanging between them. Finally, Michael spoke. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." "I know," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you did," Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't help how I feel, and I don't think you can either." Emily looked down at her coffee, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "This isn't who I am," she said, more to herself than to him. "It doesn't have to define you," Michael said gently, "but maybe it's time to stop pretending everything's fine when it's not." His words cut through her defenses, exposing the cracks she had tried so hard to ignore, and in that moment, Emily made another choice, one that would set her on a path she couldn't turn back from. Before we dive deeper into Emily's story, take a moment to let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. Now, let's get back to it. The air in Maplewood seemed heavier as summer faded into fall. Leaves turned amber and gold, tumbling from the trees and carpeting the sidewalks in a riot of color. But for Emily Carter, the beauty of the season was lost in the chaos her life had become. What started as stolen moments and secret glances with Michael had spiraled into something far more dangerous, a full-blown affair. Emily had never been a good liar, but over the past few months she'd become frighteningly adept at it. The weight of her double life pressed down on her every day, pulling her further into a web of deceit she couldn't escape. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd figure out how to end things with Michael before anyone found out. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was in too deep. Daniel, ever the pragmatic husband, seemed blissfully unaware, or so Emily thought. He continued his long hours at work, coming home late and tired, their interactions perfunctory at best. But there were moments when his gaze lingered on her a second too long, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. One evening, as they sat across the dinner table, Daniel broke the silence. "You've been distracted lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile, spearing a piece of broccoli with her fork. "Just busy with work and the kids," she replied, her voice a little too bright. Daniel nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "If there's something you want to talk about, you know I'm here." Emily's stomach churned. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she gave a weak nod and excused herself to put the kids to bed, leaving Daniel to sit alone at the table, his brow furrowed in thought. The first crack in Emily's carefully constructed facade came on a crisp October morning. She had met Michael at a secluded park under the guise of a morning run, their usual excuse for stealing moments together. They were sitting on a bench, their shoulders brushing, when Michael reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You deserve to be happy, Emily," he said softly, his fingers lingering for a moment too long. Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice trembling. "This feels so right and so wrong at the same time." Before Michael could respond, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path made them both freeze. Emily turned to see her neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of shock and disapproval. Emily's heart plummeted. "Emily?" Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice heavy with implication. Emily scrambled to her feet, her face flushing with panic. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. Mrs. Whitaker didn't respond. She simply gave a curt nod and walked away, leaving Emily and Michael standing there in stunned silence. The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, whispers had begun to circulate around town Maplewood, with its tight-knit community and penchant for gossip. Was the worst place to keep a secret. Emily could feel the stares as she picked the kids up from school, hear the murmurs when she walked into the grocery store. At home, things were no better. Daniel's demeanor had shifted, his usual warmth replaced by a cold distance. He didn't confront her outright, but his silence was deafening. One evening, as Emily folded laundry in the bedroom, Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Is there something you need to tell me?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. Emily froze, the pair of socks in her hand slipping to the floor. "What do you mean?" Daniel stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not an idiot, Emily. I know something's going on." Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she considered denying it, spinning another lie to keep the truth at bay. But the weight of her guilt was too much to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Daniel's jaw tightened, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily couldn't bring herself to look at him. "A few months," she admitted, her voice shaking. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Daniel's ragged breathing. Finally, he turned and walked out, leaving Emily to collapse onto the bed, her sobs muffled by the pillow. The days that followed were a blur of anger, tears, and tense conversations. Daniel moved into the guest room, the distance between them growing with each passing day. The kids, sensing the tension, became withdrawn, their laughter replaced by worried glances and whispered questions. Emily tried to explain, to apologize, but Daniel wasn't ready to hear it. "You broke my trust, Emily," he said one night, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever get that back." Meanwhile, Michael was dealing with his own fallout. News of their affair had reached his gym, and membership numbers had taken a hit. He tried to reach out to Emily, but she ignored his calls, consumed by the wreckage she had created. It wasn't until a confrontation with Sophie that Emily began to truly grasp the depth of the damage she had done one evening. As Emily tucked her daughter into bed, Sophie looked up at her with tear-filled eyes. "Mommy," she said softly, "why is Daddy so sad?" Emily's heart broke at the question. She struggled to find the right words, but nothing she said could erase the pain in Sophie's eyes. "I made a mistake," Emily said finally, her voice trembling. "But I love you and Max and Daddy very much, and I'm going to do everything I can to make things right." Sophie nodded, but the look of disappointment on her face was like a knife to Emily's chest. For the first time, she realized that her actions had consequences far beyond herself. The tension in the Carter household had reached a fever pitch. Every interaction between Emily and Daniel was laced with bitterness and unspoken resentment. The once warm and inviting home now felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. It was a Friday evening when the inevitable confrontation came to a head. Daniel returned home early from work, his face pale and drawn. Emily was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when he entered the room and placed his briefcase on the counter. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Emily set down the knife, her heart pounding. "About what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Daniel pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the counter between them. Emily's stomach dropped as she recognized the handwriting. Michael's. It was a note he had slipped into her gym bag weeks ago, one she had meant to throw away but had forgotten. "Found this while I was looking for my keys," Daniel said, his tone eerily calm. "Care to explain?" Emily's mind raced as she searched for the right words. "It's not what you think," she began, her voice trembling. Daniel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Don't insult me, Emily. I know exactly what it is." The room seemed to shrink as the weight of his accusation hung in the air. Emily tried to explain, to apologize, but Daniel was having none of it. His voice rose with each word, the pain and anger he had bottled up for weeks finally boiling over. "You destroyed our family for what?" he shouted. "A fling? Someone who won't even be around when the dust settles?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice cracking. I was lost, Daniel. I didn't know how to tell you. You didn't know how to tell me? Daniel interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So instead, you lied. You cheated. You put your needs above everyone else's. The sound of Sophie's footsteps on the stairs brought the argument to an abrupt halt. She stood at the bottom step, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. Are you and Mommy okay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel and Emily exchanged a glance, the weight of their daughter's question cutting through their anger like a knife. Everything's fine, sweetheart, Emily said, forcing a smile. Go back upstairs. Sophie hesitated but eventually retreated to her room. As her footsteps faded, Daniel turned back to Emily, his expression a mix of heartbreak and resolve. I can't do this anymore, he said quietly. I'm leaving. The fallout at home was only half of Emily's problems. Meanwhile, Michael had grown increasingly impatient with their clandestine arrangement. He wanted more time, more commitment, more of Emily, and he wasn't willing to stay in the shadows any longer. You need to make a choice, Michael said one evening as they sat in his car outside the gym. I'm not going to keep sneaking around like this. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with desperation. I'm trying, she said. You have to give me time. Michael shook his head. Time isn't the issue, Emily. It's about whether you're willing to leave him. Emily didn't respond. She knew what Michael wanted, but she wasn't sure she could give it to him. Her silence spoke volumes. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. I care about you, Emily, but I can't be your second choice. With that, he started the car and drove off, leaving Emily alone in the parking lot, her thoughts spinning out of control. As if her personal life wasn't enough of a mess, Emily found herself increasingly ostracized by the Maplewood community. The whispers and sidelong glances at school pickups had turned into outright avoidance. Parents who had once been friendly now crossed the street to avoid her, their disapproval etched on their faces. Even Mrs. Whitaker, who had been the first to discover the affair, made her disdain clear. You've made your bed, Emily, she said one afternoon when their paths crossed at the grocery store. Now you have to lie in it. Emily didn't respond. She knew she deserved the judgment, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Just when Emily thought things couldn't get worse, a shocking revelation turned her world upside down. Late one evening, as she was cleaning up the living room, her phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line read, You deserve to know the truth. Curious, she opened the message. It was from an anonymous sender and attached were several photographs. Pictures of Michael with another woman. They were taken outside a restaurant, the two of them laughing and holding hands. Emily's heart sank as she scrolled through the images, each one more damning than the last. She had known Michael wasn't perfect, but she had believed in the connection they shared. Now, that belief was shattered. When she confronted him the next day, Michael didn't deny it. It's not what you think, he said, echoing the words Emily had used so many times herself. Don't, she snapped, her voice cold. Just don't. For the first time, Emily saw Michael for who he truly was, not a savior, but a flawed, selfish man who had used her just as much as she had used him. And in that moment, she realized how far she had fallen. The events that followed were a whirlwind of difficult decisions and painful conversations. Emily and Daniel began the process of separating, their interactions civil, but strained. They agreed to co-parent the kids, putting Sophie and Max's needs above their own. For Emily, the hardest part was facing the reality of what she had lost, not just her marriage, but the trust and respect of the people around her. She knew she couldn't undo the damage, but she was determined to learn from it. One evening, as she sat alone in the empty house, Emily opened her laptop and began to write. She didn't know what she was writing or why, but the words poured out of her like a dam breaking. It was messy and raw, but it was honest. And for the first time in months, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. The air in Maplewood had shifted, and not in a good way. Emily's once idyllic life had crumbled into a tangle of broken relationships, shattered trust, and unresolved tensions. And yet, the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The climax was approaching, and it promised to be both devastating and transformative. It had been a week since Daniel moved into the guest room, and the distance between him and Emily felt like an insurmountable chasm. They avoided each other as much as possible, only speaking when it was absolutely necessary. But the silence wasn't sustainable, and both of them knew it. One evening, as Emily sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, Daniel walked in. He was holding a stack of papers, his expression unreadable. "We need to finalize the separation agreement," he said, his voice flat. Emily's stomach twisted. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it painfully real. "Can we at least talk about this?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Daniel sighed, sitting down across from her. "What's there to talk about, Emily? You made your choice." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I know I messed up, Daniel, but can't we try to fix this for the kids?" Daniel shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You didn't just mess up. You betrayed me. You betrayed us. How am I supposed to come back from that?" His words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she say that he hadn't already heard? "Look," Daniel continued, his tone softening slightly. "I'll always care about you, Emily. But I can't live like this. I need to move on, and I think you do too." Emily nodded silently, her heart breaking all over again as Daniel stood and walked away. As Emily tried to navigate her crumbling marriage, she found herself increasingly isolated. The whispers and judgment from the Maplewood community had grown louder, and the weight of it was suffocating. At Sophie's soccer practice, Emily sat alone on the bleachers, feeling the eyes of the other parents on her. She caught snippets of their conversations, their voices just loud enough to make sure she heard. She should be ashamed of herself. "I feel so bad for her husband and those kids." Emily clenched her fists, fighting back tears. She wanted to scream, to defend herself. But what was the point? She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. But the final straw came at the PTA meeting later that week. Emily had always been an active member, volunteering for fundraisers and organizing events. But this time, the welcome she received was anything but warm. "Maybe it's best if you step back for a while," the PTA president said, her tone polite but firm. "Given everything that's happened." Emily nodded stiffly, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She left the meeting early, her heart heavy with shame. Just when Emily thought things couldn't get worse, another bombshell dropped. Michael, who had been strangely quiet since their confrontation about the photographs, showed up at her door unannounced. He looked disheveled, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a frantic energy. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past her into the house. Emily crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "What do you want, Michael?" "I need your help," he said, his voice desperate. "Those pictures, they've ruined my business. I'm losing clients left and right. You have to do something." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "What am I supposed to do? This isn't my problem, Michael. It's yours." Michael's expression darkened. "Don't act like you're innocent in all of this. You were just as involved as I was." Emily's temper flared. "And whose fault is that you knew I was married but you didn't care? You pushed me into this, and now you want me to clean up your mess?" Michael stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You owe me, Emily." Emily shook her head, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "I don't owe you anything. Now get out." Michael glared at her for a moment before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Emily leaned against the wall, her heart racing. She had finally seen Michael for who he really was, a manipulative, selfish man who only cared about himself, and she was done letting him control her life. In the midst of the chaos, Sophie and Max had been caught in the crossfire. Emily could see the toll it was taking on them, especially Sophie, who had become withdrawn and sullen. One evening, as Emily tucked Sophie into bed, she noticed her daughter's red-rimmed eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Sophie hesitated, then burst into tears. "I just want everything to go back to the way it was," she sobbed. "Why can't you and Daddy just be happy again?" Emily's heart shattered. She pulled Sophie into a tight hug, her own tears spilling over. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. "I know this is hard, but I promise we're going to figure it out." Sophie looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. You promise? I promise, Emily said, though she wasn't entirely sure how she would keep that promise. But one thing was clear, she couldn't let her mistakes define their future. Determined to make amends, Emily began taking steps to rebuild her life. She started attending therapy, confronting the issues that had led her down this destructive path. She also reached out to Daniel, apologizing not just for the affair, but for the way she had neglected their marriage long before it happened. I know I can't undo what I've done, she said during one of their conversations, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right, for the kids and for us. Daniel listened, his expression softening slightly. I don't know if we can ever get back to what we had, he admitted, but I appreciate that you're trying. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The climax of Emily's journey came on a stormy November evening. She was at home with the kids when the doorbell rang. Opening the door, she was surprised to see Michael standing there, drenched from the rain. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice wary. I needed to see you, Michael said, his voice unsteady. I can't stop thinking about you, Emily. I made a mistake, and I want to fix this. Emily shook her head, her resolve firm. There's nothing to fix, Michael. This is over. Michael stepped closer, his desperation palpable. You don't mean that we have something special? No, Emily interrupted, her voice rising. We don't. What we had was a mistake, and I won't let you ruin my life any more than you already have. Michael's face twisted with anger. You're just going to throw me away after everything? Emily stood her ground. Yes, I am. Now leave. For a moment, Michael looked like he might argue, but then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. Emily closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She had taken back control of her life, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. The storm that rolled into Maplewood was more than just the weather. It was a perfect metaphor for the turmoil in Emily's life. With Daniel's departure finalized, Michael's toxic influence cut off, and her reputation in the community in tatters, she was left to face the wreckage she'd created. But even amidst the chaos, Emily found herself standing at a crossroads, ready to make the decisions that would define her future. As November deepened, Emily noticed subtle changes in Sophie and Max. Sophie, who had always been outspoken, was withdrawing even further, spending hours locked in her room with her books and music. Max, on the other hand, clung to Emily like a lifeline, his wide eyes silently begging for reassurance. Emily knew she couldn't ignore the impact her choices had on her children any longer. One evening, she decided it was time for an honest conversation. Sophie, Max, she said, sitting them down at the kitchen table. We need to talk. Sophie crossed her arms, her expression guarded. Max fidgeted with his shoelaces, refusing to meet her gaze. I know things have been really hard lately, Emily continued, her voice trembling. And I'm so sorry for the way I've hurt you and your dad, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you both more than anything. Sophie looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. Then why did you do it, Mom? Why did you ruin everything? The question cut through Emily like a knife. She took a deep breath, fighting to hold back her own tears. I made a mistake, she admitted. I was unhappy, and instead of dealing with it the right way, I made a terrible choice. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Max finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. Does that mean you and Daddy are never getting back together? Emily's heart broke at the question. I don't know, she said honestly. But even if we don't, we're still a family, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you feel loved and safe. For the first time in weeks, Sophie reached across the table and took her mother's hand. It was a small gesture, but it gave Emily a glimmer of hope. 2 weeks later, Daniel showed up unexpectedly at the house. Emily was in the middle of making dinner when she heard his car pull into the driveway. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door to find him standing there, his expression hesitant. Hi, he said, his voice softer than she'd expected. Hi, Emily replied, her heart pounding. I was wondering if we could talk, Daniel said, shifting awkwardly. About the kids. Emily stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. They sat down in the living room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "No matter what's happened between us, we need to figure out how to co-parent better for Sophie and Max." Emily nodded, relief washing over her. "I agree." They spent the next hour hashing out a plan, scheduling shared custody, agreeing on communication methods, and setting boundaries. It was the most civil conversation they'd had in months, and though it was far from easy, it felt like a step in the right direction. As Daniel prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I know things will never be the same," he said, his voice tinged with sadness, "but I hope we can at least get to a place where we don't hate each other." Emily managed a small smile. "Me too." Just as Emily was beginning to find her footing, Michael made one last desperate attempt to reinsert himself into her life. He showed up at Sophie's soccer game, his presence like a dark cloud hanging over the field. Emily tried to ignore him, focusing on the game, but when the final whistle blew, he approached her with a forced smile. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone pleading. Emily shook her head, keeping her voice low. "There's nothing to talk about, Michael." "Please, Emily," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I made a mistake, but I still care about you. I know you feel the same." Emily glanced around, noticing the curious stares of other parents. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You need to leave, Michael. This is not the time or the place." Michael's face hardened, his desperation giving way to anger. "You think you can just cut me out like I'm nothing?" Emily met his glare, her own resolve unwavering. "That's exactly what I'm doing. Now leave, before I call the police." Michael stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she watched him disappear into the distance. The final turning point came on a quiet December evening. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper her therapist had suggested writing a letter, not to send, but as a way to process her feelings and find closure. She picked up the pen, hesitating for a moment before the words began to flow. "Dear Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry for everything, for the lies, the betrayal, the pain I caused. You didn't deserve any of it, and I'll never forgive myself for the way I hurt you. I don't know if we'll ever be able to rebuild what we had, but I hope that someday you'll be able to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. You deserve to find happiness, just like I'm trying to do. No matter what happens, I'll always be grateful for the life we built together and the family we share. Thank you for the good times and for being the father our kids deserve." Tears blurred her vision as she signed her name. She folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, sealing it shut. Whether or not she ever gave it to Daniel, she wasn't sure, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally boiled over, bringing everything to a head. Emily's life was no longer about damage control. It was about facing her mistakes, confronting the consequences, and making the choices that would define her future. Every character was at a breaking point, and the stakes had never been higher. It was a cold December evening when Daniel finally broke his silence. Emily had just returned from a therapy session and was hanging up her coat when she found him waiting in the kitchen, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily's stomach tightened. She nodded, sitting down at the table as Daniel remained standing, a visible barrier between them. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Daniel began. "About us, about what happened, about where we go from here." Emily braced herself, unsure of what was coming next. "And?" she prompted softly. Daniel's gaze softened, but the weight of his words was palpable. "I realize that part of what happened is on me. I'm not saying what you did was okay. It wasn't. But I ignored the signs I let us drift apart, and I didn't fight hard enough for us." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it, and needing it in equal measure. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she whispered. "I know I can't take it back, but I want to make things right. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if we can fix this, Emily, but I think we owe it to ourselves and to the kids to at least try. Emily blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected this glimmer of hope, but it was enough to breathe life into the possibility of redemption. Just as Emily began to see a path forward, Michael made one last attempt to pull her back into his orbit. It happened late one night when he showed up uninvited at her front door. Emily opened it, her heart sinking as she saw him standing there, his face a mix of desperation and anger. "What are you doing here, Michael?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping closer. "You've been ignoring me, and I'm not just going to disappear." Emily stepped outside, closing the door behind her to avoid waking the kids. "There's nothing to talk about," she said firmly. "I've made my decision, and it doesn't include you." Michael's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Emily. We had something real." Emily shook her head, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "What we had was a mistake, Michael. It was wrong. And it's over." Michael grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to make her wince. "You don't mean that," he hissed. "Let go of me," Emily said, her voice rising. "Now." The sound of the door opening behind her startled them both. Daniel stepped outside, his expression thunderous. "You heard her," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Get off my property." Michael hesitated, his grip loosening before he released Emily's arm. He glared at Daniel, then back at Emily, before finally retreating into the night. Emily turned to Daniel, her voice shaking. "Thank you." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "You okay?" Emily nodded, though her hands were trembling. "I am now." In the midst of the chaos, Sophie reached her own breaking point one evening as Emily helped her with homework. Sophie suddenly slammed her pencil down and burst into tears. "I can't do this anymore," she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm so tired of everything being messed up." Emily pulled Sophie into her arms, her own tears threatening to spill over. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly. "I know it's hard, but we're going to get through this, I promise." Sophie looked up at her face streaked with tears. "Do you and Daddy even love each other anymore?" The question hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She hesitated, then chose honesty. "We love you and Max more than anything," she said. "And no matter what happens between me and Daddy, that will never change." Sophie nodded, though her expression remained troubled. Emily held her close, silently vowing to do better for her daughter. As the new year approached, Emily faced a new wave of challenges from the Maplewood community. Despite her efforts to rebuild her life, the judgment and gossip hadn't subsided. At a neighborhood holiday party, she overheard a group of parents whispering about her near the buffet table. "She's lucky Daniel hasn't taken the kids and left," one woman said, her tone dripping with disdain. Emily's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to stay calm. She approached the group, her chin held high. "If you have something to say to me, feel free to say it to my face," she said, her voice steady. The group fell silent, their expressions a mix of shock and embarrassment. Emily didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, her head held high despite the sting of their words. The turning point came in mid-January, when Emily decided to take a bold step toward rebuilding her life. She enrolled in a writing workshop at a local community center, using it as an outlet to process her feelings and find a sense of purpose. At her first session, she was nervous and unsure of herself, but as she began to share her story, she found a surprising sense of catharsis. The instructor, a warm and encouraging woman named Linda, praised Emily's honesty and vulnerability. "You have a gift," Linda said after class. "Don't be afraid to use it." For the first time in months, Emily felt a spark of hope. Writing became her refuge, a way to channel her pain into something meaningful. Before we dive into the resolution of Emily's journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means so much to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's see how Emily takes her first steps toward healing. The storm of events in Emily's life was nearing its apex, as every relationship, every decision, and every unresolved issue came crashing together. With the community's judgment bearing down on her, her children struggling to cope, and her tentative peace with Daniel hanging by a thread, Emily found herself at the center of a hurricane. But in the heart of the storm, she would discover her true strength. The first major turning point came in the form of an emergency meeting at Sophie and Max's school. Emily received the call on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the principal's voice grave as she explained that both children had been struggling academically and emotionally. When Emily arrived at the school, she found Daniel already seated in the principal's office. He looked up when she entered, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Thank you both for coming," Principal Harris began, folding her hands on the desk. "I wanted to talk about some issues we've been noticing with Sophie and Max." She went on to detail Sophie's recent outbursts in class and Max's increasing withdrawal. Emily's heart sank as she listened, guilt washing over her in waves. She knew their struggles were a direct result of the upheaval at home. "What can we do to help them?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Principal Harris offered a list of suggestions: family counseling, academic support, and creating a stable home environment. Emily glanced at Daniel, her stomach churning. Stability was something they hadn't been able to provide in months. After the meeting, Daniel stopped Emily in the parking lot. "We need to do better," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "They deserve better," Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Just when Emily thought things couldn't get more intense, she found herself thrust into the center of a public showdown. The annual Maplewood Town Hall meeting was supposed to be a routine event, a chance for residents to discuss community projects and voice their concerns. But as Emily soon discovered, it was also a breeding ground for gossip and confrontation. During the open forum, one of the more outspoken residents, Mrs. Whitaker, stood up and launched into a thinly veiled tirade about moral decay in the community. Though she didn't name names, her pointed glances in Emily's direction made it clear who she was targeting. Emily felt the stares of the room shift toward her, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical force. Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her pulse pounding in her ears. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "I made mistakes," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs. "And I've paid for them, but I won't stand here and let you tear me down when I'm trying to rebuild." The room fell silent, shocked by her boldness. "If we're going to talk about community values," Emily continued, her voice growing steadier, "maybe we should start by showing a little compassion." Though not everyone in the room looked convinced, a few people nodded in quiet agreement. Emily sat back down, her heart racing but her head held high. For the first time, she felt like she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for the person she was trying to become. Sophie's struggles reached a boiling point a few days later. Emily found her daughter in her room, surrounded by crumpled papers and tear-streaked cheeks. Sophie had been working on a school project, but her frustration had spiraled into a full-blown meltdown. "I can't do it," Sophie cried, throwing another paper to the floor. "I'm so stupid." Emily rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight hug. "You are not stupid," she said firmly. "You're one of the smartest, strongest people I know." Sophie shook her head, her voice trembling. "Then why can't I make anything work? Why is everything so hard?" Emily's heart ached at the raw pain in her daughter's voice. "Because things have been hard," she admitted, "and I'm so sorry for the part I played in that, but you are stronger than you realize, Sophie, and I'm here to help you, every step of the way." With Emily's encouragement, Sophie calmed down enough to finish her project. When she turned it in the next day, her teacher praised her work, giving Sophie a much-needed boost of confidence. It was a small victory, but an important one. As Emily worked to repair her relationship with Sophie, she also found herself revisiting the letter she had written to Daniel. It had been sitting in her desk drawer for weeks, untouched, but now she felt an overwhelming urge to give it to him. She arranged to meet him at a local cafe, her nerves jangling as she slid the envelope across the table. "I wrote this for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to read it now, but I needed you to have it." Daniel studied her for a moment, then picked up the envelope and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said simply. They sat in silence for a while, the air between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about trying to make things right." Emily's breath caught. "And? I don't know if I can forgive you yet," he admitted, "but I'm willing to try for the kids and maybe for us." It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a step toward healing, and for Emily, that was enough. Just when Emily thought she had put Michael behind her, he resurfaced one final time. This time, it wasn't a confrontation, it was an apology. He showed up at her writing workshop, his demeanor subdued and remorseful. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, standing awkwardly at the back of the room. "But I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Emily stared at him, her emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and something resembling pity. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, "but it doesn't change anything." Michael nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I understand, I hope you find what you're looking for." With that, he left, and Emily felt a strange sense of closure. For the first time, she felt free from his hold on her life. As the weeks passed, Emily's writing became more than just a therapeutic outlet. It became a passion. Linda, her workshop instructor, encouraged her to submit a short story to a local contest. Though hesitant at first, Emily eventually worked up the courage to enter. When the winners were announced, Emily was stunned to find her name on the list. Her story had placed third, earning her a small cash prize and a feature in the local paper. It was a moment of validation that reignited her belief in herself. Before we delve into the resolution of Emily's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring stories, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's see how Emily's journey concludes. The stakes had never been higher. Emily was walking a delicate tightrope, balancing her efforts to repair her fractured relationships, rebuild her reputation, and rediscover her own identity. Every decision she made carried the weight of her past mistakes, yet also held the promise of a brighter future. This was the moment where everything would come to a head. Emily knew she needed to rebuild trust with Sophie and Max, and one of the first steps was bringing back a sense of normalcy. She invited Daniel over for a family dinner, hoping to show the kids that despite everything, they could still function as a family. The evening began awkwardly, with Sophie shooting furtive glances between her parents and Max fidgeting in his seat. But as the meal went on, the tension began to ease. Daniel shared a funny story from work, and Sophie couldn't help but laugh. Max chimed in with a joke of his own, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times. After dinner, Daniel helped Emily with the dishes. "They needed this," he said quietly, nodding toward the living room where the kids were playing a board game. "Maybe we all did," Emily smiled, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. "Thank you for coming." Daniel hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not there yet, Emily, but maybe we're on our way." Just as Emily was beginning to find her footing, news broke that Michael's gym was shutting down. A series of bad business decisions and the fallout from his personal scandals had left him bankrupt. The community, which had once admired him, turned on him just as quickly as they had Emily. Emily heard about it from a neighbor and couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and pity. Michael had been a catalyst for her mistakes, but he wasn't entirely to blame. Still, his downfall felt like the closing of a chapter she desperately needed to leave behind. One afternoon, Michael showed up at the coffee shop where Emily was working on her writing. He looked haggard, a shadow of the confident man she had once been drawn to. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving town." Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said finally. Michael offered a weak smile. "Take care of yourself, Emily." And with that, he walked out of her life for good. Sophie's school was hosting its annual talent show, and despite her initial hesitation, she decided to participate. She chose to perform a piano piece she had been practicing for months, one that Emily had heard echoing through the house on countless evenings. The night of the show, Emily and Daniel sat side by side in the school auditorium, their nervous energy palpable. When Sophie took the stage, her hands trembling as she adjusted the piano bench, Emily held her breath. But as Sophie began to play, the nerves melted away. Her fingers danced across the keys with a confidence and grace that brought tears to Emily's eyes. When the final note rang out, the audience erupted into applause. Sophie beamed as she took a bow, her eyes searching the crowd until they landed on Emily and Daniel. The pride on their faces was unmistakable, and Sophie's smile widened. As they walked to the car after the show, Sophie reached for Emily's hand. "Thanks for being there, Mom," she said softly. "Always," Emily replied, her heart swelling with gratitude. The annual Maplewood Winter Festival was a beloved tradition, and despite her reservations, Emily decided to attend. She knew it was a chance to show the community that she wasn't running from her mistakes, that she was ready to face them head-on. As she walked through the festival with Sophie and Max, she felt the weight of countless stares, but instead of shrinking under the scrutiny, she stood tall. When she passed Mrs. Whitaker, the older woman gave her a curt nod. Not exactly an olive branch, but not the cold shoulder Emily had come to expect. Later, as Emily and the kids sipped hot cocoa by the bonfire, a woman she recognized from the PTA approached her. "Emily," the woman began, her tone hesitant, "I just wanted to say, it's good to see you here." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. The woman nodded, then walked away, leaving Emily with a sense of tentative acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step forward. The results of the local writing contest were announced at a small ceremony at the community center Emily attended, not expecting much, but proud of herself for entering. When her name was called as the third-place winner, she was stunned. As she walked to the front to accept her certificate, she felt a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. This wasn't just about the contest. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. After the ceremony, Linda, her writing instructor, pulled her aside. "You've got something special, Emily," she said. "Don't stop now." For the first time in years, Emily felt a spark of ambition reignite within her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was starting to thrive. The final pivotal moment came on a snowy evening in February. Daniel showed up at the house unannounced, his expression unreadable. Emily let him in, her heart pounding as she led him to the living room. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Daniel began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "About us, about the kids, about everything." Emily held her breath, waiting for him to continue. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were," he said, "but I think we owe it to ourselves, and to the kids, to try." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "You mean that?" Daniel nodded. "I do. But it's going to take time and it's going to take work. Are you ready for that?" Emily nodded, her voice trembling. "I am more than anything." As they sat together, discussing how to move forward, Emily felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Before we reach the conclusion of Emily's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's see how Emily's story ends. The storm that had upended Emily's life had finally passed, leaving behind a changed landscape. Relationships had been tested, choices confronted, and wounds slowly began to heal. As Emily looked back on the whirlwind of events, she realized that the journey wasn't just about finding forgiveness. It was about rediscovering herself. Emily and Daniel took things slowly, focusing on rebuilding trust while prioritizing Sophie and Max's well-being. They attended family counseling together, sessions filled with honest conversations, raw emotions, and, most importantly, progress. One day, during a particularly emotional session, Sophie spoke up. "I just want us to be happy again," she said, her voice trembling. "Like we used to be." Daniel reached for her hand, his expression earnest. "We're working on it, kiddo. And I promise, We're going to get there. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but small victories began to pile up. Family dinners became a regular occurrence, filled with laughter and stories rather than tension and silence. Sophie started excelling in school again, and Max, who had always been quieter, began opening up about his feelings. For Emily, these moments were a reminder that while the road had been painful, it had led to something worthwhile. Emily's victory in the local writing contest was just the beginning. Encouraged by Linda and the other members of her workshop, she began submitting her stories to larger competitions and literary journals. To her surprise, one of her pieces, a deeply personal essay about redemption and resilience, was accepted by a regional magazine. When the magazine arrived in the mail, Emily held it in her hands, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't just about being published, it was about proving to herself that she was capable of something meaningful. One evening, as she worked on her laptop at the kitchen table, Sophie approached her with a shy smile. "Can I read your story?" she asked. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Sophie sat down beside her, and as she read, Emily watched her daughter's expression shift from curiosity to admiration. "This is really good, Mom," Sophie said, her voice filled with awe. "You should write more." Emily smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I plan to." Michael's departure from Maplewood marked the final chapter of a tumultuous relationship Emily heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to a nearby city to start over. Though their last encounter had been civil, she felt no lingering attachment, only relief that the door had closed for good. For Emily, letting go of Michael wasn't just about ending their affair. It was about releasing the guilt, shame, and anger that had tethered her to the past. She no longer saw him as the man who had disrupted her life, but as a reminder of the choices she never wanted to make again. As Emily and Daniel worked on their relationship, they discovered a new kind of love, one built on honesty, vulnerability, and mutual respect. It wasn't the same as the passion they'd shared in the early days of their marriage, but it was deeper and more enduring. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel turned to Emily and said, "I never thought we'd get here." "Neither did I," Emily admitted. "But I'm glad we did." Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Me too." Though the road ahead was still uncertain, they faced it together, stronger than they had been before. The Winter Festival had been a turning point for Emily, but true acceptance from the Maplewood community came gradually. It started with small gestures, a friendly wave from a neighbor, a kind word from another parent at school. Over time, the whispers faded, replaced by cautious support. Emily joined a new book club, where she found a group of women who valued her honesty and humor. For the first time in months, she felt like she belonged. At the spring fundraiser for the school, Emily was asked to give a speech about resilience and second chances. Standing in front of the crowd, she took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. "We all make mistakes," she said. "But mistakes don't define us. It's what we do afterward, how we learn, how we grow, that truly matters." The applause that followed was more than just polite. It was genuine. And in that moment, Emily knew she had earned back her place in the community. The growth Emily saw in Sophie and Max was one of the most rewarding parts of her journey. Sophie became more confident, excelling in her classes and making new friends. She even started mentoring younger students, offering them the same support she had needed during her struggles. Max, who had always been reserved, surprised everyone by joining the school soccer team. Though he wasn't the best player, his determination and teamwork earned him the respect of his peers and the pride of his parents. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Max looked up and said, "I think we're a pretty good team." Emily and Daniel exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with love. "We are," Daniel agreed, "and we always will be." On a warm summer evening, Emily found herself sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in hand, as she watched the fireflies dance in the yard. The house was quiet, the kids asleep, and Daniel working late, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt at peace. Her laptop sat beside her, the screen glowing with the outline of her first novel. It was a story about mistakes and redemption, about the complexity of love and the strength it takes to rebuild. It was, in many ways, her story. As she looked out at the yard, She thought about how far she had come. The mistakes she had made would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. She had found forgiveness, not just from Daniel and the kids, but from herself. Emily took a deep breath, the scent of summer flowers filling the air. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to face it. Thank you for joining us on Emily's journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring recaps and heartfelt tales. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and keep watching for more incredible stories.